As .NET developers, we will work with Microsoft Azure sooner rather than later. But are you familiar how to wire everything up and how to set up your development environment with ASP.NET Core and Microsoft Azure? If not, then this video is for you because I will walk you through the entire process from creating an application to deploying it on Microsoft Azure. Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. I have received a lot of feedback to create videos on Microsoft Azure related topics. And here we are. What would be a best way to start than a video on creating and setting up an entire development environment with ASP.NET Core and Microsoft Azure from scratch. This means that in this video we'll walk through the entire process of creating the services that we need in Azure, to configure the services that we need in Azure, and wiring everything up, and finally deploying an API to Microsoft Azure. Therefore, let me show you where we will start off. The starting point to our journey is this very simple API. We have here this very basic products controller, and I use the DB context directly into the products controller. That's now how I would do it in a real production application, but on that I have a lot of videos in the software architecture channel. But for these demo purposes, we just want to keep things as simple as possible. We have here this DB context and we have implemented all the necessary CRUD endpoints for this. And one thing that I want you to pay attention to is that in the program.cs I have already added a DB context so that we can get everything faster. But I haven't added a connection string to the app settings.json file and I haven't performed any migrations. Because migrations is something that we will add at a later point when we have our Azure SQL database already up to date. And to have a better overview or a more visual overview about what we try to actually achieve here in this video, I would run the API right now. And here we have this very basic Swagger documentation, and the end goal obviously for this entire journey is to deploy everything on Azure and to perform and to test our API directly in an Azure web application. Because right now if we test it, obviously it would fail because we don't have a database connection. To do this, we will need to get familiar with a few basic Microsoft Azure services and concepts like resource groups, like Azure SQL, like WebApps, and also basic Azure networking. And the first thing to get started is to create a resource group. You can think about a resource group like a container that will contain all your Azure services that you need for one specific Azure solution. In other words, a resource group will include Azure resources that you want to manage together as a group. So in the end, you are the person that will decide what services belong to a certain resource group or not based on what it would make sense for your scenario and for your specific use case. To keep things very simple, we'll settle for an approach where we create a resource group that will hold all the needed Azure services that we'll need for our specific solution. So deploying our API to Microsoft Azure, what are all the Azure services that we need, and those services will be placed in one specific resource group. So let's head over to the Azure portal and create a resource group. So here is our Azure portal, and to get started and create a new resource group, we'll use this create a resource button. And here we'll just search for resource group. And then we select this very entry, and then we click here on create, obviously. And this will take us to a very simple wizard. First of all, we can just choose the subscription. I only have one subscription, so it would be probably this one. Then we have obviously to give a name for our resource group, and I will give it a name like CWK for Code Wrinkles, Dev and Setup, something like this. And then we will also have to choose a location. Now the idea is that we need to choose a location from one of the Azure regions that we have at our disposal, because that resource group itself as a very basic information also needs to be stored somewhere. But it doesn't really mean that all the resources that you will create for this resource group will be in the same location. So I will actually choose a location that's, well, probably the most convenient and the most appropriate for me, because it's in West Europe, it's in Europe because I'm located in Europe. Now, when it comes to regions, there is one thing that I would like to tell you. Not all services are available in all Azure regions. So depending on what service you might want to add at a certain point, you might not find it in a specific region that you are looking for. Now, this West Europe regions, I guess it's one of the oldest regions in Europe, probably, I guess, with the first two regions that were ever created by Microsoft Azure as a data center. So in this West Europe region, we have virtually everything that Azure can offer. So I will choose this one. Now, obviously, then we can click on this review and create, and then we just need to create a resource group, and it will take just a few seconds, and we will be then redirected to the resource group itself. And here's our resource group right now. It's obviously empty because we haven't created anything in it so far. Before we go any further, I would have a big favor to ask to you. This is the first Azure video on this channel, so I would be glad to have your feedback on what other Azure topics you would like to have covered on this channel in the future. So head over to the comment section and just let me know what Azure topics you would like to see in this channel. Also, if we are at this point, please hit the thumbs up button on this video if you like it so far, and if you are for the first time here on the channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell so that you are always notified when there is new content on the channel. Let's get back to our journey. So we have created our container, our resource group that will contain all our Azure services for this specific solution. The next thing that we want to create and configure is obviously an Azure SQL database, because we will need a database for this API. To do this, we are here inside our resource group, and that's very important. And here inside the resource group, once again, we can click just simply this create button and we can search for Azure SQL, and that's what we want to look for. And once again, here is the very first entry that we receive as a result. That's what we need in this case. And then we just need to click create. Obviously, creating an Azure SQL database is a little bit more complicated, so we'll have to kind of like explain all of the steps that we do here, because I would really like to have you understand all the basic concepts about working with this type of services. Now, first of all, we need to choose what type of services that we need. So we have here the SQL database, we have this SQL managed instance, or we have an SQL virtual machine. Now, the idea is that the SQL database is a fully platform as a service database, SQL database, Microsoft SQL database, obviously, and that's what we want to have. Now, the SQL managed instance is something that's mostly used for scenarios where you want to lift and shift your applications from on-premises to the cloud, and it kind of like offers a little bit of both worlds, like it's still platform as a service, it's fully managed, but the feature compatibility with the on-premises SQL setup is a little bit higher than what we have in a regular SQL database. And then we have an SQL virtual machine, when you basically will get a virtual machine that has SQL Server installed on it. So it would be like a regular on-premise SQL server, but it would be hosted in cloud as an infrastructure as a service. Now, as I said, we want to go fully platform as a service. That's what we as developers most often do. So in this case, we'll choose this SQL database. And then here we have another choice to make, like the single database, an elastic pool, or a database server. Now, a single database, as the name implies, is just a regular and single database. An elastic pool is a little more advanced concept that kind of like involves the idea of scalability, and instead of having resources that are dedicated to a certain database, you have a pool of resources, and then you would have different type of databases that will consume resources from that specific pool. Now, obviously, this elastic pool is a little bit more expensive than the regular single database, and since the goal of this journey is to create a development environment that we would mostly use as developers, what we would have to do here is we'll choose this single database and once again click on this create button. This will bring us to this other screen where we have to make also a lot of different other choices. Now, first of all, okay, we have already the resource group, which is pre-populated because that's where we started to create Azure SQL service. But if we would have different resource groups, we could just choose another one if we would like to. Now then we have to give here some more database details. First of all, we need to give a name to this database, and let's give it the name CWK from Code Wrinkles, devenv setup, and let's call it SQL. So that would be the name. And then we need to select a server. Right now we don't have a server, so we need to create one. And that's a concept that's also, you will see, is similar to when we have a application, like, okay, you create a database, but in order for database to work, it needs to be associated to basically a logical server. So what we need to do is to create this server. And let's call it once again CWK, and then devenv SQL server. Then here we can choose the location once again, and I want to have all my resources in West Europe, so I will choose this location. And here then there is another very important thing, like obviously you need to connect and to authenticate yourself to this database when you want to work with that. For instance, when you are running your application locally on local host, but you still want to connect to this database in Azure, that's a connection that you would have to make through the database server. And in order to be able to do that, you need to be able to authenticate yourself, and also configure some network things, but we'll come to this a little bit later. Now, here we have these three options. We can use Azure Active Directory. For authentication, we can use both SQL and Azure Active Directory or regular SQL authentication. Now I will choose this regular use SQL authentication, and this means that I would have to provide here a username and I would have to provide here also a password. And now we would be good to go. We can click on OK. This will take us back here to our initial configuration screen. And then comes a next very important step when we need to select this compute and storage, and the selection that we do here will affect how much our database will cost. And by default, we see that we have this selection that well, is for general purpose. And they say that it's most budget friendly, but this is based kind of like on virtual cores. And you see that the total cost here that's estimated is $396. Now, for me as a developer and for pure development purposes, this is really not budget friendly. So here there is another discussion, because we have these options when we select a tier to select a tier that is based on virtual cores, like in this case, you would pay for some processing power that you will get, or you can have this DTU-based purchasing model. Now, DTUs is a database transaction unit. It's an acronym for that. And what this means is kind of like a pre-calculated metric on how much CPU and memory you would need for a certain read or write operation. And based on that, Microsoft Azure made a unit out of that. And you can select one of those ones. And here you can have this basic for less demanding workload standard, and this premium. Obviously, we will select this basic, and you see that right now the cost per month is reduced to just $4.90, which is actually very, very nice. And we have these 5 DTUs. Obviously, we can increase the number of the DTUs, but once again, for development purposes, for very, very small things that we might want to run our application for, that's totally fine. So we can just select apply here, and we would then be able to go. Now, the next thing that we do is to, well, select a backup storage redundancy option. Here, as once again, we talk about setting up a development environment, what we want to do is have only locally redundant storage. Now, what this means is that locally, it means that your database will be kind of like backed up only on the region or on the data center where you host your database. If you have zone redundant backup storage, then it will be hosted also or replicated also somewhere in the same zone, but not in the same data center, which is important because one data center might go down, but other data centers in the same zone might be still available. And by the way, usually in Microsoft Azure, they have at least 2 data centers for each zone, so that if one fails, you still have one other data center in that zone. And then geo-redundant storage is the option that it will also replicate your backup also to other regions. So not only to locally or to the same zone, but also in another region. Like in my case, as I have this West Europe, it might replicate it to also US. And here you need to pay attention to another very important thing, especially if you're developing applications for EU customers, because we have this GDPR, and that's this common idea of data residency, and that all data should reside inside the European Union. So if you create basically a backup that will go, or that will be saved or stored in the West US, for instance, that would be a problem from GDPR perspective. So this is one other point that you really need to pay a little bit of attention. And then obviously we are ready, and we can click review and create, and this will create our database. Okay, so now our deployment is ready. It took a couple of minutes, so let me go to this resource. And better said, let me go to home first, because I want to really show you how this kind of like would work. So I would like to go to the resource group. And now in the resource group, I would be able to see these 2 new services that were created. So we have created an SQL database and an SQL server. Now, before we are able to go one step further, there are 2 very important things that you need to perform here in order to set up your development environment. So for the first thing, we need to go to this SQL server, not to the database, but to the SQL server itself. Now, when we open the server here, we have different type of informations that we can review and kind of like look a little bit into what we can do here. But what I would like you to do right now is go here under security on this networking tab, because that's very important. And the reason why this is important is because right now you have this SQL server, but you will not be able to connect to this SQL server from outside. And as a .NET developer, you will need to do this in case you want to add the migrations, for instance, from your Visual Studio. Like you create a migration and you want to update the database, then basically your Visual Studio that will run on your IP address will need to talk to the SQL server that runs in Azure. And by default, that will not be possible. So what we'll need to do here is we can go here on selected networks, and then we can already click once on save, but that's an important step. And then if you go here under firewall rules, you see that you have add your client IPv4 address. This automatically sees what your IP address is that you are currently using, and you can add this IP address as a whitelist. However, if you have an office that you share with several other employees, or if you are located, I don't know, maybe in different locations, then you might create here more complex firewall rules that kind of like, well, are applied to IP ranges. So that's totally fine. But the idea is that if you want to do this or to connect to this database from your local machine that is not hosted in Azure, you will need to have this whitelist in the firewall. So let's click on save once again, and we should be good to go from this point of view right now. That's a very important step. Otherwise, you won't be able to update your database and you will receive errors later in this journey. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to get the connection string for this. To get the connection strings, let me go back to the resource group, and this time I want to go to the SQL Server database. And if we go to the database, we see that here we have under settings, we have this connection string. And under ADO.NET, I know ADO.NET probably is not a naming that kind of like is very appealing or very popular or known to you, but the idea is that you can use as a .NET developer this exact connection string. And what I will do here is I will just copy it, I will paste it in a notepad, because we will need to use it later. One important thing that you would need to pay attention to is that in this connection string, you would also have this username ID, user ID, and the password. And here the password has a placeholder, so you might need to replace this placeholder with the password of your SQL Server admin that you have created when you have defined the SQL server. So that's a very, very important step. And obviously, for obvious reason, I will not show you the connection string after I will have pasted my password there. So you have to kind of like make this on your own. Now we are almost done. Don't forget to edit your connection string and add your password to it, because we will need a working connection string a little bit later when we want to wire up our API with Azure SQL. The last thing that we need to do is to create an Azure web app, and you can think about an Azure web app as your very own web server. To create an Azure web app, we start once again from inside of our resource group, and we click this create button, and this time in the marketplace we will search for web app, and it's the first result that we have here, and we choose it and then click on create. Okay, so some of the things are very similar to what we already have seen in the SQL creation, but some things are a little bit different. First of all, obviously, we already have the resource group selected, which is okay. That's the resource group that I would like to have. Then the next thing is we need to create a domain name. Now, the domain name will be by default or have this .azurewebsites.net. However, the name that you create or the name that you choose needs to be unique throughout all the domain names that or subdomains from azurewebsites.net. So probably you will have to tweak or to play around a little bit to find a name that is not already taken. So I have this CWK, then webapp.devenv and setup, and this seems to be available. So I will choose this one. Then there you have this option publish. Like, how do you want to publish your web app? Is it regular publishing? You want to publish your code binaries, or do you want to host it in a Docker container? That's also an option, or you want to have it as a static web app. Right now, we will just concentrate on this very basic setup where we publish it regular, where we have our code binaries running basically on an IIS server. Now you have to select the runtime stack, and that's a very easy step, as we will have an ASP.NET Core 7 application or .NET 7 application. We will obviously choose this .NET Server as a runtime stack, and then we can also choose the operating system. And here is, as .NET runs both on Linux and Windows, you can choose either one of them, but I will stick to the Windows. And then we need to have this region. And once again, I would want to have my application in the same region. So I will look for West Europe, which is right here, and that should be fine. And here comes a very interesting concept, which is in a way similar to what we have in an SQL. And you see that here is Windows plan. And this plan, like an app service plan also called, is, you can imagine it as being a physical or a logical server in which you host different web applications. And the billing for your Azure web app is actually made on the app service plan, not on the web app itself. This in turn has some advantages that we can use as developers in our advantage, and I will talk about it just a little bit later. Now, the thing that we need to do, since we don't have an app service plan already, we need to create a new one. And here by default, they say, okay, we want to create this new app service plan with this name, which I found is okay. And then you have to select the pricing tier. Once again, as said, the pricing plan or the billing plan is per app service plan, not per Azure Web App. So let's look a little bit into this one, because obviously here they also put you on a default that costs quite a little bit. But we would have here different types of options. Obviously, a lot of options, they cost a lot, but we will concentrate on those that cost less. And here we have basically three options that we can take into consideration. One of them is the free plan, in which is everything is free, so you don't have to pay anything. But the problem is that you are restricted to only 60 minutes of use or CPU use for one day. So that could be a restriction that's a little bit, easy to hit. So the next one would be shared, and here you will have a restriction of 240 minutes per day. Now, the idea on the shared environment is that your web app is basically shared with other web apps that use the same pricing tier. Like, they share the same infrastructure, and if that infrastructure is a little bit overloaded, then your response times might have to suffer just a little bit. And then the first pricing tier that is, let's say, not shared with others is this basic, and we will choose this basic. Still, this costs quite a bit, but I will tell you a trick that you could use a little bit later. So let me just select this basic one. And then what we have here is this zone redundancy, which is not available in this case. So let's then now create on review and create. And once again, we need to just wait a little bit, and yeah, everything seems to be fine, and let's create that. The trick with the Azure App Service plans is that you can run several different Azure web apps in one single app service plan. And this will help you to optimize your costs. For instance, I was running for years around 6 different web apps with 2 databases in one single app service plan. So basically, I paid once for that basic app service plan, but I had 6 different web applications that were using that service plan. Obviously, my applications were not that traffic intensive, so it was possible. In your case, depending on what applications you would like to place in that app service plan and how much traffic you have to those applications, you might need to take a look a little bit on how resources are shared there, and eventually also configure auto scaling. But this is still a very good trick to keep your costs under control while creating several different web apps in the same app service plan. So right now we have our working API, we have an Azure SQL database, we have an Azure web app, and everything seems to be configured. The next and final step is obviously to wire everything up together, to set up our Visual Studio ID, to work with our cloud services, to create migrations, to update the database, and last but not least, obviously to deploy the API to our Azure web app. To wire everything up, the first thing that you need to do to make your life way easier is to go here under File, and here you have this account settings. And in these account settings, you can add different accounts that you have. Like, for instance, I have this GitHub account, so that kind of like I can really talk to GitHub very easily. And then I have added already, because I had it from the past, this account on which I also have my Azure subscription. So the important thing here to do is to simply add a new account, or to add the account for which you have created that Azure subscriptions, where you have created that resources. And this will help you really much because you can easily integrate your Visual Studio IDE with your Azure subscription, and this will make your life way easier. The next thing to do after you have added your account for which you have that Azure subscription where you have created your resources is go to the SQL Server Object Explorer, and here what we would like to do is we would like to add our Azure SQL Server to the Object Explorer, because this is once again will make our lives way easier. And here in this option you see that you have 3 drop downs. You can choose from locally, from the network, and or if you have a server on Azure. And here we can see that, hey, this is my SQL server that I have created, so I will just use this server. Now here is one place where you need to provide the password, the admin password that you have created for the SQL admin when you have created the Azure SQL server. So let me type in the password, and let's also click this remember me, and hopefully I have typed it correctly, and then let's click connect. And after a few seconds, we see that we have this new server here. And if we go here to this server, we see databases. And obviously right now we don't have, we have only this database, which is obviously empty. But the idea is that here in this database, we will update it with our migrations and we'll have the tables that we need for our API. The next thing to do obviously is to add our connection string to the app settings.json file. So let's go to the app settings.json file, and here after this allow all hosts, let's have this property of connection strings, and here we'll have the first connection string that we'll call Azure, because that's also the name that I have created or that I have used when registering the DB context. And here is the part where you would have to paste the connection string that you have copied earlier and to which you have replaced the password placeholder with your regular password. Now that we have also the connection string and everything is okay, we can just go to the tools, package manager console, NuGet package manager console, and we can just add our migration first. So let me just wait until it gets initialized. So let's add migration initial, and we see that it completed successfully, and we got this migration right now, and we see that it will create a table for our products with the ID, with the name, and with the description. Obviously the next step right now to do is update the database. So update database. Cool, so the update is done now. We can also take a look and check here. We can click on the tables and refresh, and we will see that we have these two tables, which is the products, which is a table that we have created for the migration. Then we have this migration history that is created by Entity Framework, as we would expect. So we have right now connected our development environment to our Azure SQL database. We have added the migration, and we have updated our Azure SQL database with the migration that we have previously created, everything from the Visual Studio IDE. So now we are nearing the final steps to deploy this application to Microsoft Azure. However, before we do this, I remember that I think I forgot something to configure in the Azure portal. So let's go back to the Azure portal for a second. Here in this Azure portal, I would like to go once again to the SQL server, once again not the database but the server itself, and also on the network configuration there is another checkbox that I think we forgot to check, and that is a very important one. If we scroll down here, there is this checkbox, allow Azure services and resources to access this server. And this is important because if we don't check this checkbox, our Azure web app will not be able to access this SQL database, and we need this to happen because the Azure web app that contains our code that uses the DB context will try to access the database. So we need to access that. So let's just click on save, and then we should be good with this one. Now let's go back to Visual Studio. Here in Visual Studio, there's one final thing that I would like to check, and please pay attention to this. So make sure that this app use Swagger and app use Swagger UI is not placed in an if environment is development, because by default in the template it is like that. But we don't want this to happen. We want to be able to have or to access the Swagger UI in our Azure web app directly, and therefore this needs to be also available when we build it for release, or when we build this application for release. Okay, now that we are covered, then we have to do the final steps, and this is publishing this web application to Azure. And we could use some more complicated stuff, like for instance CI/CD pipelines with Azure DevOps, but we'll stick here to this very simple approach and learn everything or how things are connected here in our IDE to So we can publish our application to Microsoft Azure directly from Visual Studio. To do this, we just need to right click the project, and here we have this publish button. And this publish button will take us to this screen where we can create a publishing profile. So let's click here on add a publishing profile, and we have here a wizard that will walk us through all the needed steps. First of all, we need to check Azure because we want to publish to Azure. Then we need to check this Azure App Service for Windows because we have chosen Windows for the app service that we have created. So let's once again click next here. Here there are some things you see that because we are logged in here also in Visual Studio, or we have added the account that also has this Azure subscription. Once again, here we already see listed the available web apps that match these criteria. And we can choose this one. And here there is one important checkbox, deploy as zip package. And this is a very important part because if you don't check this checkbox, most probably your publishing will fail. And the reason for this is because you would probably have to install some additional packages, because in that case, the application as it should be run in Azure Web App will be built here on this machine, and probably some things are missing that are specific to Azure Web Apps, and therefore it will fail. So, but if we check here deploy as zip package, it will kind of like zip the code that we have, and it will kind of like build it and publish it directly on the dedicated web app. So I want to deploy as a zip package. So let's click here on the next. Here there is the step where they want us to also have an API management instance, because Visual Studio sees that this is an API. However, I wouldn't like to use API management in this case, and if you want to have a video dedicated to API management, then just let me know in the comments and I will then probably create one. And for now, let's skip this step and then click just finish. Okay, so now that we have our publishing profile, the next thing that we can do is obviously click publish. This will build our application for release and it will try to publish it to Microsoft Azure. Okay, and we see here the information that everything was published correctly. And I see that it already or automatically opens our application. But obviously right now that we have published directly here on the root, we don't have anything. But if we go right now to swagger.index.html, voila, we have the Swagger UI directly in our Azure Web App, so the deployment was successful. And to check things up or to see that everything works, let's first of all try to create a resource, like using this post, and try it out. Here, let's say C#. I will say here that's a programming language. We assume that's a product, and then we just click on execute, and this will execute our query right now. So we did get this response that 201 created as expected, so it means that everything was okay. And to prove once again that things are working, let's just also try out this endpoint that gets all the products, and we see that it got our response. So we have covered quite some ground in this video. We have started from a very basic API and we have created all the needed Azure resources so that we can deploy our API to Microsoft Azure. Before we conclude, there's one final word of caution. Azure resources will generate costs. So in order to optimize the cost consumption, and as long as you have this as your development environment, there is one thing that you can perform. For instance, at the end of the day or when you don't need those services anymore, just shut them down where possible so that you avoid unnecessary costs. That will further optimize the cost consumption of your Microsoft services. And I would call this a wrap. If you're for the first time here, please subscribe to this channel and also hit the notification bell so that you are always notified whenever something new happens on the channel. And obviously, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button, like it, because this will make it easier to discover for other people that might find it very useful. And if you have any type of question or suggestion, or if you want to simply say what type of topics you would like covered here on this channel on Microsoft Azure and .NET, then just head over to the comment section and leave me a comment, and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.